shadows, from Bay of Pigs to missile crisis. The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion reverberated far beyond the beaches of Cuba, sending shockwaves through the corridors of power in Washington, Moscow, and Havana. What had begun as a covert operation to remove a troublesome Caribbean dictator had evolved into something far more dangerous, the catalyst for the most perilous nuclear confrontation in human history. In the immediate aftermath of the invasion, President Kennedy undertook a painful process of self-examination and policy reassessment. The young president, who had entered office with such confidence and vigor, found himself humbled by the reality of Cold War politics. In private conversations with his advisors, Kennedy acknowledged that he had been poorly served by the intelligence community and that he had made critical errors in judgment. How could I have been so stupid? Kennedy reportedly asked his aide Ted Sorensen in the days following the invasion. The president's anguish was not just about the failure of the operation, but about the broader implications for American credibility and his own presidency. Kennedy understood that the Bay of Pigs had made him appear weak and indecisive, particularly in the eyes of Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev indeed drew his own conclusions from the Bay of Pigs failure. The Soviet leader had been testing Kennedy since the beginning of his presidency, trying to determine whether the young American president had the resolve to stand up to Soviet pressure. The Bay of Pigs suggested that Kennedy might be willing to authorize aggressive action, but lacked the courage to see it through to completion. This assessment would influence Khrushchev's behavior over the next 18 months, leading him to become increasingly bold in his challenges to American power. The Soviet leader believed that Kennedy could be intimidated and that the United States might not respond decisively to Soviet provocations. Meanwhile, in Havana, Fidel Castro was drawing his own lessons from the invasion. The Cuban leader had survived the most serious challenge to his rule, but he understood that the United States would likely try again. Castro became convinced that he needed stronger defenses and more reliable allies if he was going to survive future American attempts to overthrow his government. Castro's concerns were well-founded. The Kennedy administration did not abandon its efforts to remove the Cuban leader after the Bay of Pigs failure. Instead, the president authorized a massive covert program called Operation Mongoose, designed to destabilize Castro's government through sabotage, economic warfare, and support for internal opposition groups. Operation Mongoose was far more extensive than the Bay of Pigs invasion had been. It involved hundreds of CIA operatives, millions of dollars in funding, and a wide range of activities designed to make Castro's Cuba ungovernable. The operation included plans to sabotage sugar mills, oil refineries, and transportation infrastructure. There were also numerous assassination plots against Castro himself, ranging from poisoned cigars to exploding seashells. The existence of Operation Mongoose was not known to the general public, but it was well known to Castro's intelligence services and to the Soviet Union. The ongoing American campaign against Cuba provided both countries with compelling evidence that the United States was determined to overthrow Castro's government by any means necessary. This evidence became crucial in the summer of 1962, when Khrushchev made the fateful decision to deploy nuclear missiles to Cuba. The Soviet leader later claimed that his primary motivation was to defend Cuba against American attack, and the Bay of Pigs invasion and Operation Mongoose provided powerful justification for this argument. However, Khrushchev's motivations were more complex than simple solidarity with Cuba. The Soviet leader was also concerned about the nuclear balance of power, which heavily favored the United States. American missiles in Turkey and Italy could strike targets throughout the Soviet Union, while Soviet missiles could only reach American territory from Soviet soil. Placing missiles in Cuba would give the Soviet Union the ability to threaten American cities and military installations from close range. The decision to deploy missiles to Cuba was made in the spring of 1962, more than a year after the Bay of Pigs invasion. The timing was not coincidental. Khrushchev had concluded that Kennedy was both aggressive enough to authorize attacks on Cuba and weak enough to be deterred by the threat of nuclear retaliation. The Soviet decision-making process was remarkably secretive, even by Cold War standards. Only a handful of top Soviet officials were involved in the initial discussions, and the decision was made without consulting Cuba's leadership. Castro was informed of the Soviet decision only after it had been made, though he enthusiastically agreed to accept the missiles. For Castro, the Soviet offer represented the ultimate security guarantee. Nuclear missiles on Cuban soil would make it virtually impossible for the United States to launch another invasion like the Bay of Pigs. The Cuban leader understood that the missiles would make his island a potential nuclear battlefield, but he calculated that the deterrent effect would be worth the risk. The installation of the missiles began in the summer of 1962, carried out under extraordinary secrecy. Soviet ships transported the missiles and supporting equipment to Cuba in carefully orchestrated convoys. The missiles themselves were medium-range ballistic missiles capable of striking targets throughout the eastern United States, including Washington, D.C. The Kennedy administration remained unaware of the missile deployment for several months. American intelligence agencies were monitoring Soviet activities in Cuba, but the scale and secrecy of the operation made it difficult to determine exactly what was happening. When American reconnaissance flights finally detected the missile sites in October 1962, the discovery triggered the most dangerous crisis of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as it came to be known, brought the world closer to nuclear war than it had ever been before or since. For 13 days in October 1962, the United States and Soviet Union engaged in a tense diplomatic and military standoff that could have resulted in the destruction of both countries and much of the world. President Kennedy, who had been so deeply affected by the Bay of Pigs failure, approached the missile crisis with a very different mindset. He was determined not to repeat the mistakes that had led to the earlier disaster. Kennedy assembled a carefully selected group of advisors, known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm, to help him manage the crisis. The discussions within ExComm revealed how much Kennedy had learned from the Bay of Pigs experience. The president insisted on rigorous analysis of all options, demanded detailed contingency planning, and refused to accept the CIA's assessments without independent verification. Kennedy had been burned by trusting the intelligence community too completely during the Bay of Pigs, and he was determined not to make the same mistake again. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis required exactly the kind of careful diplomacy and strategic thinking that had been absent from the Bay of Pigs planning. Kennedy and Khrushchev engaged in a complex negotiation that involved public statements, private communications, and back-channel diplomacy. The final agreement required the Soviet Union to remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba and the secret removal of American missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended peacefully, but its resolution highlighted how directly it was connected to the Bay of Pigs invasion. The American pledge not to invade Cuba was essentially an acknowledgement that the Bay of Pigs had been a mistake, and that the United States would not repeat it. Castro had achieved through the missile crisis what he had been seeking since the Bay of Pigs, a credible guarantee that the United States would not try to overthrow his government by force. The nuclear dimension of the crisis also demonstrated how a relatively small conflict could escalate into a global catastrophe. The Bay of Pigs invasion had involved fewer than 1,500 men and had lasted only 3 days. Yet it had set in motion a chain of events that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war just 18 months later. The connection between the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis illustrates one of the most important lessons of Cold War history, that seemingly local conflicts could have global implications, and that failed operations could have consequences far beyond their immediate objectives. Kennedy's decision to limit American involvement in the Bay of Pigs invasion was intended to prevent escalation, but it actually contributed to a much more dangerous crisis later. The irony of this sequence of events was not lost on Kennedy himself. The president, who had been criticized for being weak during the Bay of Pigs, was praised for his restraint and wisdom during the missile crisis. Kennedy had learned from his earlier mistakes and had applied those lessons when the stakes were much higher. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis marked a turning point in the Cold War. Both the United States and Soviet Union had looked into the nuclear abyss and had decided to step back. The crisis led to improved communication between the superpowers, including the establishment of the hotline between Washington and Moscow, and to the first nuclear arms control agreements. However, the crisis also left Cuba in a unique position in the Cold War. Castro's government had survived both the Bay of Pigs invasion and the missile crisis, and it had secured Soviet protection against future American attacks. Cuba would remain a communist state throughout the Cold War and beyond, a testament to the unintended consequences of the failed invasion that had been intended to remove Castro from power.